Hi, welcome back, everyone. So we learned about Jose Marti. Now we're going to learn about the causes of the Spanish-American War. What were some of the major events? Didn't last that long. But more importantly, what were some of the repercussions of the Spanish-American War, including our involvement in the Philippines? So let's get started with the causes. So in the 1890s, when all of this drama was going on between Cubans trying to get independence from Spain, Spain, harshly cracking down on these rebels in Cuba. The American newspapers, of course, trying to sell, get more readership and so forth. They would publish these articles that kind of stretched the truth a little bit. And you had competing newspapers led by a guy named William Randolph Hearst and another guy named Joseph Pulitzer. So Hearst and Pulitzer would often compete with each other to try and see who can have the most sensational headlines to increase readership. And of course, the more readers you get, then the more advertising revenue you get for your newspapers. So when I talk about sensational stories, I mean they stretch the truth and they exaggerate things, and which means they kind of make up stuff in order to sell newspapers. And there was a term for that back then. It was called yellow journalism. Now know that yellow journalists are different from the muckrakers. The muckrakers were journalists who were trying to expose a lot of this stuff that was going on from unfettered capitalism in order to bring changes and reforms and get people to get Congress to pass laws to reform these, conditions that they're talking about. Yellow journalists were just printing crap in newspapers to increase readership. And, so they really weren't concerned about the truth. They were more concerned about how many people were reading their newspapers. So please don't confuse the yellow journalist with the muckrakers. And the word yellow has a connotation meaning cowardly. So the yellow journalist is kind of like when you look at the Globe or the News of the World over in England, or the National Enquirer, those tabloids you see in the grocery store checkout line when, they always say, like, I don't know, Brad and Angelina are getting back together, and I don't know, Jennifer Lopez is pregnant with A-Rod's baby. All that stuff we know is crap. But anyway, that's like yellow journalism. So a lot of these newspapers were making money off articles that were about this stuff going on in Cuba all throughout the 1890s. And then in particular, in 1898, there was because they were Americans there. Remember I said that there were American planters there. We had involvement in Cuba, even though it was still part of Spain. In early 1898, we sent a ship there, which it's called the USS Maine, and we were trying to, I'm sorry, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So, for example, there was one, and I'll talk about that in a second. I'm getting a little, there was one American newspaper that said that that there was a Spanish general that were feeding Cubans to the sharks. Of course, this stuff was not happening. There were other articles that were saying that Cuban officials were strip searching American women. That also was not happening. Now, of course, Americans would read this and like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. How can we let the Spanish do this to American citizens? And so you started to see Americans calling for war against Spain, which is exactly what these newspapers wanted. A lot of these newspapers, they were warmongers, and, they were just kind of taking advantage of the mood of the Americans at the time. Yeah, that's a shark eating a Cuban. Of course, that didn't happen. Oh, and here's one of the articles showing, of course, this was not true. This is false. This is yellow journalism for you, showing these Spanish searching women, American women, in Cuba. Of course, that never happened. All right, so yellow journalism is basically when newspapers owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer were publishing sensationalized or exaggerated stories to sell more newspapers. This is going to be one of the causes of the war against Spain, or what we call the Spanish-American War. So like I said, in early 1898, to protect Americans living in Cuba, President McKinley sent a battleship called the USS Maine to the harbor in Havana, Cuba, which is the capital. And in February 9th, on February 9th, 1898, there was a letter that a Cuban rebel got a hold of and sent it to Hearst, one of these newspaper publishers. And it was written by the Spanish ambassador in the United States. And we now call it the De Lo May letter. And the De Lo May letter is also another cause of the Spanish-American War, besides yellow journalism. And the reason why this letter was a cause to the war is because the Spanish ambassador, who was located in the United States, was writing a letter talking crap about our president. And this is the part that angered the Americans. And when they heard this, they're like, oh my God, we need to go to war. And then something else was the straw that broke the camel's back, and I'll get to that in a second. So here's what this De Lo May letter said that ticked off Americans. And this was published by Hearst in February 1898. It said, McKinley, you know, we've basically trying to say that this will show McKinley for what he truly is. McKinley is weak, and he is a bidder for the admiration of the crowd, besides being a would-be politician who tries to leave a door open behind himself while keeping on good terms with the jingos of his party. So what they're saying is that our president was weak, and that all he cares about is, you know, people liking him. And, you know, he says one thing, but, you know, to make himself look good. But then on the other hand, he's trying to keep these jingoists. And jingoist people, you'll learn about on Monday. They were people who were very American, or I'm not sorry, they're not American. They could be English, they could be French, but a jingoist is somebody who is very nationalist. And we learned from last year what the flip side of nationalism is. It's racism. So jingoist is somebody who thinks that their country is better than anybody else's, but they're also very aggressive in their military policy to try and show how superior they are. So jingoism is just a very aggressive militaristic form of nationalism. And he, you know, this De Lo May letter, the Spanish ambassador, is just basically saying that, you know, William McKinley just feeds into these jingoists in the United States. So anyway, when this got published, the Americans were ticked off, and about a week later, the USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. And on this ship, there were 260 U.S. sailors that died. And nobody knew what caused the explosion at the time, but a lot of the Americans, and of course the yellow journalists, were saying it's Spain's fault. They sent a torpedo. It blew up our ship. We need to declare war against Spain. So after the De Lo May letter and then the explosion of the USS Maine, these were the two reasons why the United States declared war on Spain. Now, of course, McKinley tried to avoid war, but eventually he would declare war against Spain, and it would not last that long. But here's the explosion of the USS Maine, which, by the way, years later, they found out when they sent divers. This is like, I don't know, 100 years later, less than 100 years later. And they went down to Havana, and they went down and explored the wreckage. And they actually concluded, in which some people had said for generations, that it was not caused by Spain. It was actually a mechanical failure in the American ship. So it wasn't even, it was just like a oopsies. But people in the United States use it as an excuse to declare war against Spain. But it wasn't even their fault. Anyway, that's what happened to the USS Maine. It sunk to the bottom of the harbor. And of course, like I said, decades later, they would send divers, and they would do the forensics, and they concluded that it was probably caused by mechanical malfunction, not a Spanish torpedo. So we declared war on Spain in April 1898. There were a lot of Americans who were very eager to participate in the war because they wanted to liberate the Cubans from Spanish rule, but also there were other people who saw this as a chance to make money because imperialism was a strong drive with a lot of these big business people in the United States. So the U.S. Army, when we declared war against Spain, it went from 30,000 to over 274,000 men. And remember, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time was Teddy Roosevelt, and he quit his position to get a volunteer regiment together of cavalry members. They, from the West, they were a bunch of what were they? They're a bunch of cowboys and gamblers, and from the East, they were these posh polo players, and they trained in Tampa and Florida before they went down to Cuba, and that volunteer cavalry regiment would be known as the Rough Riders. And so the Rough Riders, along with 17,000 other troops, arrived in Cuba in June of 1898, and Roosevelt and his men, they captured, remember, this hill, San Juan Hill. It was a major battle, and they charged uphill, and they actually won. And that made Teddy Roosevelt this, even though he had no military experience, but remember, he was good with a gun, and he was a pretty impassioned guy, loved adventure. They, you know, for a guy who had no military experience, afterwards he would receive the Medal of Honor from, you know, his activities with the Rough Riders in Cuba. So there he is. Now, once Americans had taken Santiago, Cuba, the Spanish tried to retreat by racing their ships out of the harbor, but the United States captured their ships or they sank them. So pretty much after that, it was over, and Spain had to declare defeat. And so the United States defeated Spain in 1898. It only lasted 4 months. The Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, which we will talk about next week, he called it a splendid little war. There's John Hay. The peace treaty with Spain established Cuba. So here are the repercussions of the Spanish-American War. It said Cuba was an independent nation. And the United States would also gain another Spanish territory, Puerto Rico, along with Guam, which is out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and also, well, we'll talk about the Philippines in a second. Now, only 345 Americans died in combat fighting the Spanish-American War. However, 5,000 soldiers died of diseases, and a lot of the diseases down there, you know, malaria was the cause of one of them. And the United States is going to learn how to deal with malaria, and they're going to find this ingredient called quinine, and they're going to use it as an inoculation to fight against malaria. And this is going to serve them well when these engineers go later on to build the Panama Canal. But anyway, so that's where the Americans first learned how to use quinine. They were dealing with malaria in their soldiers in Cuba. So in 1903, there was a treaty years later with Cuba, and the United States would lease land to establish a Navy base in Guantanamo Bay. And we will talk about that treaty. That will be in a bell work that you guys will have to do. So here's a timeline of Spanish-American War. Cuba was a Spanish colony, but there were U.S. tobacco and also sugar farms there. The Monroe Doctrine, which dated back to the early 1800s, told the Europeans to pretty much keep out of the Western Hemisphere. So in 1895, there was a Cuban revolutionary named Jose Marti. He failed to get the Cubans independence. A lot of these Cuban rebels were put in concentration camps, very cruelly treated. And then the yellow journalists seized on these stories. They tend to exaggerate stuff and make up stuff. They were very anti-Spain in their articles, and it pretty much stirred the pot. And so yellow journalism was a cause of the Spanish-American War. So the United States declared war on Spain in April 1898 after the De La May letter, and then a week later, the explosion of the USS Maine in the harbor at Havana. Teddy Roosevelt went down there. He was successful with the Rough Riders. They won at the Battle of San Juan Hill. He got the Medal of Honor. And then the Treaty of Paris was the treaty that ended the Spanish-American War. And the Teller Amendment at 1898. The Teller Amendment pretty much is why we have Guantanamo Bay in Cuba to this day. And it said that Cuba would be independent in name only. We'll talk about that more in detail. And then the U.S. would get the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Now, speaking of the Philippines, on the other side of the globe in the Pacific Ocean, over there off the coast of mainland Asia, so off the coast of Vietnam, south of Japan, was a Spanish territory called the Philippines. And before Congress declared war on Spain in 1898, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, had sent a telegram to the U.S. Admiral over there in the waters of Asia, Admiral George Dewey, and ordered him to attack the Spanish in the Philippines in Manila if the U.S. declared war with Spain. So he's basically telling this guy Dewey to be ready to attack the Spanish in the Philippines if we go to war. So be ready. Now, the Filipinos had already been trying to get independence from Spain, led by a general, a Filipino named Emilio Aguinaldo. And the Filipinos would attack the Spanish army and government officials, and they used guerrilla warfare tactics. And so Emilio Aguinaldo is pretty much like, you know, the Jose Marti, but to the Filipinos. Now, 5 days after the United States declared war on Spain, this would be in April 1898, Dewey's fleet arrived in Manila, which would be the capital, still is to this day, of the Philippines. And Spain's old wooden ships were no match for America's new ships. We'll talk about those ships next week in American naval superiority. Our ships were made out of steel. And our Navy was very well trained. In fact, it's, you know, slowly but surely becoming a Navy that would be in competition with the British. So Dewey was able to blockade the port of Manila. And the Filipinos thought, hey, the United States Navy is here. They're going to help us get independence from Spain. Yay, the United States. But when Spain surrendered to the Americans in 1898, the U.S. negotiated in that Treaty of Paris in 1898 to buy the Philippines from Spain. Congress voted to annex the Philippines. And it was because they thought the Philippines, being so close to China and all this other trade, would help American businesses and, you know, establish a military presence in the Pacific Ocean and protect our business interest over there. So that was the Treaty of Paris. That was the treaty that ended the Spanish-American War. Of course, the Filipinos, they were outraged. You know, they thought that America was there to help them get independence from Spain, but now America is just their new foreign overlords. And so they start fighting back against the American occupation forces. And this went on for about 3 years. And the Filipinos used very aggressive military tactics. They used guerrilla warfare. And guerrilla warfare is like when you use sneak and attack, sneak and ambush type tactics, hit and run, because they knew they were outnumbered by the American forces. But equally, the Americans were quite as brutal to the Filipino rebels. And this fighting lasted for about 3 years and ended in 1902. And when the United States sent, you know, more businesses over there, they helped develop the Philippines. They brought them new hospitals. They built new roads, telecommunications, schools. And so the Filipinos did benefit from American involvement. And of course, though the intention was not really to stay there forever, the Jones Act of 1916 gave the Filipinos the right to elect both houses of their own legislature and promised eventual independence if the Filipinos could prove that they can govern themselves. And the United States eventually granted the Philippines independence in 1946. But of course, this was after World War II. So that's our involvement in the Philippines. Oh, look, there's some guerrilla warfare tactics. By the way, they're not actually fighting with tigers. It's just a meme I found on the internet. So here's the Philippines in essence. It was annexed in 1898 because the U.S. wanted a Navy base in the Pacific. Emilio Aguinaldo and Filipinos fought a guerrilla war with the Americans for 3 years to try and get self-rule. But in 1902, the war ended and the U.S. rebuilt the Philippines. And in 1916, the Jones Act promised the Filipinos eventual independence, which they would get in 1946. So that's the United States involvement in the Philippines. So answer some questions. And the last thing we're going to learn about is the building of the Panama Canal. All right. So I'm going to stop the recording and see you later, guys.